Hello and welcome to a new 3D Fluff video. I've been away for a while preparing this new Octane 2020 video for you. In the video today we've basically got the first 50 minutes of the full Octane training package. Here we'll learn how to get through the basics of the interface and how to do lighting. If you like what you see here and you'd like the rest of the lessons, head on over to 3dfluff.com where you'll find the rest of the video suite all there waiting for you. Right, so the basic gist of this tutorial is this is going to be assuming that you've used 3D software before, you're familiar with cinema, and you've used some render engine before. So we will not be explaining and wasting your time with the basics like what bumps and normal maps and displacement are. I am going to assume you have a certain base level of knowledge. If you've never used any 3D rendering software before, maybe go have a play with the built-in render engines first and then come back to this a bit later, because this is not really for the absolute utter beginner to 3D. Okay, with that said then, here of course is our cinema interface. Now I am going to switch this out because there's a lot of stuff here we don't need, and there is one rather crucial part of Octane which you kind of always need to see. If you come up to your Octane menu, you will have a live view window. Now if you've never used an engine like Octane before, one thing you need to know is that this idea of having this live render view always visible, always working, is a very integral part of working with the render engine. So for example, if you're only ever used to perhaps using Cinema's built-in engines, as I suspect probably most of you watching this tutorial will be, you're going to be used to the general process of working with your models, adding some materials, and when you want to see what this actually looks like with the shadows and reflections and global illumination, you're going to be hitting your render button to see what it actually looks like. Now that process, it's probably going to be quite ingrained, but that's something we need to break. The idea with Octane's live view window is that you always have this fully rendered, photorealistic view constantly visible. Now in reality, if you're actually going to be working with this properly, you're almost certainly going to have two screens at your workstation, hopefully. So typically you tend to use this as your second screen, or you at the very least dedicate a large portion of your interface to this in your main interface. Now of course with the tutorial we're kind of limited to space, so we're just going to have to compromise a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch over to an Octane layout I've already prepared. And all we've really done here is we've got our main 3D view over to the side. Here is Octane's live view window, and down at the bottom we have our object manager, our materials and our attributes. So things have just moved around a little bit, but hopefully that's not too confusing. Okay, so let's dive into Octane, how we use it, and all the rest of that shenanigans. So let's make a new project. So when you're working with Octane, the first button you're going to need to know, so we'll just throw Cube in for now. The first button you're going to need to know about is this guy here. It looks like a little Blender icon, which is kind of ironic really, given there's another bit of software called Blender. This is the send to graphics card button. It is going to use your graphics card to do the processing. Your CPU will sit there virtually in its sleep mode. It won't really do much, and it's all about how much graphics card power you've got. So if you're messing around with some old GeForce 950, time to upgrade. You want something with a bit more kick. Anyway, this is your button. Click it. As soon as you click this, you will send your 3D data to the graphics card, and the nice thing about this is it will continuously render. So as I start navigating and working, my rendered view, although it's not really much to look at the moment, my rendered view will constantly update. I never have to sort of keep hitting render view to see what I'm going to get. You will just always have this realistic rendered view to the side. Now of course this is not really much to look at, so let's just make it a little tiny bit more interesting for the moment, and we're going to go over to objects, lights, and we're just going to add an Octane area lights. Now either feel free to follow along with this tutorial or just kick back and watch, that's up to you, won't judge you. We're just going to chuck in an area light, and we're going to plop it over here just so we get a little bit of shading going on in our project. Now it will look a bit naff until we sort of get the sky in the background and everything else sorted out, but for now I just want to get a little bit of shading so you can at least see this is sort of rendering what we're getting. On the topic of this light, you might be thinking, well, hold on, why didn't he just add a light, or why didn't he just add an area light from this menu over here? And truth is, you're not really going to use these. Although Octane does use Cinema's lights and cameras and skies and other objects, the problem they've got is that these lights, they don't really have the settings which Octane needs. So for example, Octane, it wants you to be able to set settings such as the temperature of the light. Is it warm? Is it cool? It wants you to be able to choose sort of sample settings and a few other bits and pieces. Those settings simply aren't present in the light, and unfortunately there's no way for them to actually add those settings to Cinema's light. So what they do is, when you add any of these objects from the Octane objects menu, so we're talking cameras, environments, lights, these will add a standard Cinema 4D light. It's just that what you'll find is there's this extra little tag over to the side. Let me just make these tags a little bit larger. So you'll get these extra tags to the side. So if I had a camera as well, you'll see the same thing. We do get a cinema camera, but the extra Octane settings will be found in the tag. To be honest, you can actually just select the camera and you'll find that the Octane settings will appear as a tab at the end. But to be honest, you're just kind of filling your settings here with a whole bunch of stuff which really doesn't do anything anymore because the Octane settings have taken over. So do feel free to just click directly on the tag, and now you're going to see all the things that actually make any sort of difference. So going through the objects then. We do want to be able to, of course, show you the materials and lights, but we're not going to be able to do this whilst we've got this great big light grey environment, because this is absolutely flooding our project with tons and tons of light. So what we're going to do, let's just delete out these lights and cameras that we don't care about for the moment. First thing I would tend to do when I'm working with most Octane projects is add one or two background skies. If you come up to Objects in your Octane menu, you've got a HDR environment and a texture environment. Now these both, strictly speaking, these are actually both just sky objects, great big spheres which wrap around the scene. They're just set up very, very slightly differently for different tasks though. So what you're going to find is if you want to wrap a HDR image around your project, obviously go for the HDR environment, and down here you will find the settings for it. Now there is one thing I do sort of have to mention. This is something that's going to come up a few times. Although in many areas in Octane you will have the option to click these three little dots over to the side where you'd normally go and choose a file on your hard drive, please never actually do this. Octane needs extra settings. It needs extra information when you load an image. And the problem you've got is if you click these three dots to the side and you go choose some file from your hard drive, so here's just my general textures folder, here's my HDRs. If you just choose one of these HDR files, it will appear to work and you'll think, okay, cool, great, I can just choose files. But that's actually a really, really bad way of doing things, because by missing those important extra settings, you're going to struggle. You're going to think, well, how do I change the brightness? How do I change this setting or that setting? Why can't I find this setting? And the problem is you're not going to get it, because what you need to have whenever you load any image, and this goes for lights and textures. In fact, frankly, if there's any one really critical thing you learn from this video set, it's this. Anytime you want to load a texture, and that goes for your materials too, always make sure you use an image texture shader. So if you don't have one of these, you will get one by default when you add this environment object. But if you don't have it, or if we're talking about materials, you will find it under your general shaders list, and you will find there is an Octane subfolder of shaders. And in here you will find image texture. This must be used every time you load any sort of image. Now there is one already present here, so we'll just click on here to get the settings. And these are the settings I'm talking about. Power, gamma, sort of alpha mode, what it does with color space. You're going to be missing these. But so long as we click on, okay, I'm just going to go back and show it again. So let's click on the tag to the side of the Octane sky. There's our image texture shader. And this is where you load the file. Okay, so if I load some sort of HDR into here, let's just grab something I've got laying around. I'll throw a few in the download folder for you, just so you've got something to work with, but I'm going to load the good old kitchen. This HDR image gets around quite a bit. Okay, so that's going to wrap it around our project. We can now see kind of what we're doing. We're going to actually be getting some sort of light from our kitchen environment here. And you'll notice. So here's one thing. If you're used to Cinema's traditional render engines, you probably know about Cinema's global illumination settings. Having to set things up, samples, all the rest. You don't need this for Octane. Octane's render engine, if you like, fundamentally is global illumination. It's there pretty much all the time, whether you want it or not. You can turn it off, but really, honestly, there's no benefit. You're not going to get faster renders by disabling it. So just one thing to keep in mind, global illumination is just always there. Okay. But now we've got this in, settings-wise, once you've loaded in your texture, really, to be honest, the main settings for this HDR are going to be the power settings and the position. So power, again, here's another thing in Octane you're going to generally get. Most settings will have values of 0 to 1. Now this will represent no power or full power. Some settings will go above and beyond. So for this environment here, for example, 1 basically represents full power for this HDR. Of course, if I set it to 0.5, I'm going to get half the brightness. I can turn it down, or I can actually sort of boost it above. I could go 1.5, so that's sort of 1.5 times the normal power. But there you go. So there's the brightness of your environment. But as I say, the other setting you're going to want for this mostly is just the position. So if I go back to the Octane sky with the little Octane tag next to it, rotation. Now, don't rotate the sky. And by that I mean don't grab the rotate icon and start trying to rotate it and spin it around. This will seem to work at first glance, so I'm spinning the sky around, but you may notice something slightly odd. Despite the fact that I'm sort of spinning this round all over the place, the image never actually tilts. So even though I'm sort of spinning it sideways, we never lean to the left or lean to the right. It always remains completely upright. If I get a wider angle, that might help see what's going on. We're always upright. It doesn't matter what I do with this texture if I spin it all the way around. So there's just a fundamental disconnect here. Octane doesn't like you rotating the sky object to try and place where the environment is. So let's just reset that back to where it should be. I'm going to reset my position, scale, rotation. Pop that back. Get back to a more sensible angle. And the setting you're really after is in this Octane tag you have on your sky. You're going to have rotate X and rotate Y. So basically this lets you spin it left and right. This is the setting you probably want. And then rotate Y will let you sort of pan up and down. But yeah, don't actually rotate the object. It doesn't really work all that well. Okay, now with these environments then, so there is probably another thing you're going to generally want to do. Once you've dropped your HDR in there and it's nicely lighting up your scene, oh, by the way, just a little hint. If your window here does ever stop rendering, if you're navigating around and you've noticed this window here has sort of stopped and it's no longer synchronized with what you're doing, just re-hit that first little blend Octane icon and it'll resend the data and restart the render engine over to the side and sort of synchronize it up again. Where was I? Okay, yes. So traditionally, once you've got a HDR background in there, it's great for lighting, but they don't tend to actually look very nice if you look at them. So, you know, here's my kitchen. It's just this horrible, blurry, low-resolution mess. Great lighting, but terrible to look at. So you want to get rid of it. Now, again, this is going to be different in Octane. You would traditionally add a Cinema 4D. Oh, I've rearranged all the tags in R21. You can never find anything. Where did they put it? It used to be a Cinema 4D tag, and it's now rigging render, compositing. So it used to be a compositing tag where you'd choose settings like scene by camera, scene by reflection, scene by global illumination. I'm afraid this tag doesn't work in Octane. Flat out, fundamentally does not work. So forget about it. Don't use it. It won't help you. Instead, we do something very slightly different for this. And this is specific for skies. There is another method for hiding objects, which we'll get to later, perhaps in a little while. But for the sky, this is my HDR sky, which I'm using to illuminate things. So what I will actually do, I will actually rename it so I can keep track, because what I'm going to do is add another sky, but it's hard to keep track of which one's which. So this, rename, this is my HDR sky, and under Octane objects, we're going to add a texture environment. Now this allows you to just flat out choose a color or choose an image to insert behind everything. But you will notice once we've added it, it's sort of bleached out to that white background again. This is because they're both fighting against each other. And if they're fighting against each other, frankly, just whichever one is at the top of the list always tends to win. So what we do with this new sky, and I will just rename this to perhaps Viz, just for the visible sky, go to its Octane tag and scroll down a little bit, and we should find there is a setting here called Type, Primary Environment. This means show it visibly and use the lighting from the object as well. That's what both of them are trying to do. If I set my visible sky, however, to... Well, you're dropping down there, but if I set this to visible environment, this sky here will now only be used for the actual directly seen sky, whilst my HDR, which is set to the primary environment, this will be used for lighting. So you do tend to end up with two skies in most Octane projects, one for lighting, one for visible backgrounds. But once that's in, I can now choose my visible skies Octane tag. And it has a shader in there. This is just an RGB spectrum. This is one of Octane's shaders again. So the RGB spectrum is just a flat color. It simply lets you choose a color for the background. You could, if you want, replace this with an image texture. So if you do have some sort of wraparound image you'd like to insert, you could do that instead. But by default, the RGB spectrum, if we click on it, it will allow you to just simply choose a color to your liking. Personally, I tend to just go with black because I'm going to be filling my project with actual real physical items for putting stuff in the background. Just one little thing, by the way. You may notice, hold on, my color sliders don't look the same as yours. This is because I've changed one of Octane's settings. The default color picker in Octane, in my humble opinion, is a bit naff. It doesn't look very good. It's not very nice to use. I far prefer Cinema's color pickers. I find they're much more friendly with all these different color picking modes, all these sliders, all these nice color wheels. I just think they're better. If you'd like to change yours as well, come up to this cogwheel icon in your live view. This is the Octane settings. Now, keep in mind, this is it's a bit of a weird mix of render settings and preferences for Octane. So not the best layout, I'll be brutally honest. Some of this stuff would have been far better placed into Cinema's preferences. Hint, hint, Otoy, it would be great if you put the preferences in the preferences. But for now, if you come to the settings over to the edge, and we go for, where is it? Let's see, account, nope, shaders, other. Yes, here we go, right. So in amongst this big old rat's nest of settings, smack bang in the middle, we have color graphical user interface type. The default is to be Octane-like. This gives you sort of quite dull, boring grey sliders, and you can only really choose sort of RGB colours. It's not very friendly. Personally, I changed mine to be Cinema 4D native. I think they look better, and I think they're more useful. And I also do the same with the sliders. If you're wondering why your sliders have got all these silly little tick marks on them, it's because I've also changed my sliders to be C4D-like instead of Octane's default. Those are my preferences. You go with whatever works for you. Okay, where were we? We were doing environments. Okay, yeah, I think that's all there is to really say about them. One sky for lighting and another sky for the visible colour. And we now have sort of a nicer, subtler bit of lighting going on. Okay, so that's the environment object sorted. Just before we continue though, we're going to do a little bit more setup. We're about to dive into Octane's lighting system. But rather than having to keep going into these menus and down into submenus to find things, I'm actually going to add a few icons to my toolbars because I'm going to keep reusing certain things a little bit. So just before we go any further, let's go to, let's right click on a toolbar and choose Customize Palettes. Okay, this window will now let us find things. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some things to this toolbar here, and because we're going to do some materials later, I also like to have some materials down here to quickly sort of dive into and get to. So if I just search Octane in my list of things, here's all the extra icons you can add for Octane. Now, personally, I do, in my day-to-day life, I do actually have the live view window and settings on a toolbar as well. But because we've got them here permanently in our tutorial display, I won't have much need for them. But things which we will definitely need for later will be the Octane camera. So let's drop this over there. We're going to want an Octane area light. We're going to want an Octane daylight. And one of the newer ones is the Octane spotlight. That can go there as well. And so they're the main things we're going to need, but we will also need some materials. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make a new palette, just this new little window where we can drop some extra icons. And if I search for material, that should filter it down a bit further. So we've got diffuse materials, we've got glossy materials. We'll skip a couple. We're not going to cover absolutely everything in Octane. We're just going to do the bits you actually realistically need most of the time. We'll go for a metallic material, and we'll go for a universal one. And the name which always gets a lot of people is specular. Specular. You may be used to a specular channel in a material being how shiny and glossy it is. Octane uses this word in a completely different way. A specular in Octane is transparent glass, or liquids, I guess. So these are sort of your main material types: diffuse, glossy, metallic, transparent specular, and then universal. There are some others. We may take a look at those, but I won't promise. Anyway, and this toolbar, I'll tell you what, we'll flip it around if we right-click. Okay, and we're just going to spin it around. So if we change the orientation, just a heads up, if you're using an older version of Cinema, this might be called something like transpose or swap horizontal vertical. Can't quite remember what it was called, but they changed the name of the setting. And I'm going to take this toolbar and I'm just going to drop this guy over to the side of my materials. So I've just got a really nice quick little way of grabbing some materials for later. Okay, and when we're done, close the window, and we're kind of good to go. And I'll tell you what, just to make sure this this interface looks the same later, I will just choose Window, Customize, Save as Startup Layout. This ensures it just always looks like this. So there we go. We can quickly add Octane materials there. We can quickly add cameras and Octane lights. We no longer have to faff around in all these sort of sub-menus trying to find the things we're after. Okay, right, so we want to deal with some lighting. Let me just get rid of a bunch of stuff here I've added. So we'll lose those. Don't want materials just yet. Okay, but we're going to keep our HDR sky and our black background. So the Octane area light is really sort of your bread and butter. This is the main thing you're going to need to use to light up most of your scenes. As with many of Octane's objects, it does sort of piggyback on the back of a standard Cinema 4D light. And you might be thinking, well, hold on, isn't there already a Cinema 4D area light? Why do we need another one? And, well, the thing is, the actual light itself, the sort of standard traditional cinema settings, none of these are used. Octane does not use the color or brightness or shadow settings in your light. It's only really there as a quick in-editor display and a quick object for you to quickly resize. All these settings do nothing. The only settings we really care about are this Octane light tag you see off to the side. This is where the real stuff actually makes some sense for us. So the settings are relatively straightforward. There shouldn't be anything too scary in here. At the top, you've got power, and this is going to choose just how bright this light source is, so you can really crank it up and bleach things out, or cut it back and have a much more subtle little light shining down on the scene. Watch out for the power setting. It's this setting, it's sort of non-linear. So you might notice my slider starts down here at 0, virtually. And then when the slider's halfway up, my setting's only sort of 0.5. So you might assume that when I go up to the full power, my power would be 1. So if we have 0, 0.5, you're probably going to expect it to be 1. But when I click, it's almost 6,000. This is a exponential slider. Octane uses these in a few places. Basically, if this was 0, 0.5 and 1, between 0 and 0.5, sorry, actual 0.5, there's not that much difference. So you would have to sort of keep sliding the slider a really long way to get anything useful. So what they do is they make the slider sort of work visually linearly. So as I turn this up, you will notice the brightness gets higher and higher and higher and higher. Basically, just don't get caught out on this. Sometimes you're going to want to just type in values. If you've got a brightness of, say, 50 and you want to double it, you're probably better off typing in 100, because trying to get this thing to be sort of twice as bright, boom, suddenly you're at 400, or a few clicks later you're at 8,000. It increases very, very rapidly. But there you go, there's your brightness. And the other thing you're going to want to know about Octane's lights is that they use a real-world color temperature system. So you'll probably notice this if you've got a bit of a mixture of light bulbs in your house. Certain lights will have a nice warm orange glow to them, whereas others will be a much more cool blue, almost sort of uninviting colour. Probably the lights in your kitchen and bathroom will be a lot more white and bluish than, say, the lights in your bedroom or your living room. Now, this is the colour temperature. If you've never come across this before, it's fairly straightforward. Low values are warm, high values are bluish. So if I turn this down, we've now got like an old incandescent light. If I keep going even further, we're down to a nice warm firelight. And if you go even further, you've got something sort of lit by candle or naked flames. If you go too far, you get this sort of silly red, which you're not really going to see much in real life. But sort of values around the mid-mark, something between, say, 3,000 and 9,000. Those are real-world values. So sort of naked flames, fireplaces, light bulbs, LEDs. And if you go up higher, you're going to start getting into the realm of daylight, which has this sort of a cool blue hint to it. So choose whatever colour takes your fancy. I do tend to find the temperature is a little bit on the cool side. The default is 6,500. So this is measured in Kelvin, by the way, if you're curious. Personally, for a bit more of a neutral look, I tend to knock these down to about 6,000. I tend to find that's more of a neutral, inviting neutral white. Okay, underneath, texture and distribution. Okay, let's say we have a sort of shiny, glossy object. Now, I am, of course, going to have to nip over here and do some materials, but let's say we've got our cube. I'm just going to give it some slightly rounded edges because this helps show lighting a little bit. And I'm going to grab one of my glossy materials. Now, just in case you didn't do this toolbar thing, you can do this by going up to your Octane menu, up to Materials, and add yourself an Octane glossy material. And I'm just going to drop this onto my cube. Oops, sorry, let's add the material first. And then we'll drop this onto the cube. So I now have a sort of a white glossy finish to my object. The problem you can get with light sources, especially if they're a bit brighter, so I'm just going to turn down the power of my HDR sky, just so it doesn't interfere too much. Just going to turn that down quite low, not completely off. We'll leave a bit of light in there. And I'm going to increase the brightness of my light source. So on my Octane light, or rather its tag, I'm just going to pop the power up to a bit too far. Okay, so I've sort of done about 7. Your values will vary, by the way, depending how big your scene is. So keep in mind, because Octane uses real-world values, if this light source is further away, it gets dimmer and dimmer. So depending how big your scene is, you may have different size defaults from myself. If you notice things are too bright or too dark, just move your light further away or closer, or if need be, resize the light, because the size of the light will also determine how much light it actually emits. But anyway, I'm just going to get this reasonably well lit cube here. But you'll notice, we can see a reflection of the light source reflecting in the surface. The setting we're going to look at first then is texture. This allows you to create some sort of image on the light source itself. So in real life, if you've got a light bulb behind some sort of translucent lampshade, it doesn't just give you this solid block of sort of consistent light. Actually, I'll tell you what, we're just going to make our material a bit darker. So I just want to show this reflection a bit more. So I know it's skipping ahead a little bit, but on your glossy material, on its diffuse channel, we're just going to darken the colour. There we go, that's a bit easier to see now. Okay, so back on our object. So we're talking about this reflection of the light you can see in the surface. What we can do is on the Octane Lights Octane tag, bit of a mouthful there, we're going to go to the texture, and basically here we can load images and shaders to sort of modify what the light looks like. One of the most common things we'll do is just put a simple gradient in. So on texture, come to the pull down menu, and we'll go for just a standard cinema gradient. Just watch out, there is an Octane gradient, but it's not as good. Cinema's gradient is better, so we can use that one instead. Okay, so you can now see we've got a gradient on the light. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the gradient settings, and I'm going to change the type from a two-dimensional gradient going in the U direction, in other words, sideways, and I'm going to switch this over to a circular gradient. So this now goes from one colour in the centre to another on the outside edge, but this is a little bit odd because it's the wrong way round. So on the gradient gadget, we're going to right-click, and we're going to choose, can't I see my menu? There we are. We're going to choose invert gradient. It's just going to flip my black and white the other way around. And this is kind of what I'm after. I'm after a nice warm, a nice bright glow in the center, and I want it to fade out as it reaches the edges. Feel free to tweak the gradient to sort of pull that in a bit more, or if you want to leave the edges of that light exposed a bit, you could go a bit higher. But that's what I'll tend to do for a lot of my light sources, because without it, you just tend to get these fairly bland slabs of light which aren't all that nice looking. With the gradient in there, you get it's more of an interesting thing. You get more of an interesting shape. It actually looks perhaps like a light source actually reflecting in the surface. Okay, so that's what the texture is. You can just dump an image in there, and when reflected, you will actually see that texture within the light. Distribution, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Distribution is the ability to texture where the light goes. So let's forget this cube for a moment. Let's throw in a flat plane. We'll make it large, and we'll just make sure that our Octane... Actually, no, I'll tell you what. The Octane light is slightly penetrating through, but we don't really mind because it leaves this sort of nice little bit of a lighting down over here. So with this, even though we've got this gradient in here, you don't really get it in your scene so much. Let me maybe change it to a more sort of a obvious shape. I'll go back to a linear gradient, and I'll just make it sort of go bright white, black, bright white, black, and then bright white again. So I've just got these sort of three quick stripes in there. Now, even though they're in there, and even though they're sort of being emitted, you don't really see the stripes on the ground. You know, they're there, and they do sort of affect the lighting, but this is more about how the light appears in reflections rather than the light which it actually emits. That, if we go back to our light tag, now that's the texture of the light, but there is another box underneath called distribution, and it's similar-ish, but it's going to work in a slightly different way. So what you can't do with the texture is really sort of project any sort of shape out of the light source. Even with these quite harsh stripes, you're still going to get a pretty soft, pretty even glow. So what you can do instead is we'll just get rid of this guy here. And under distribution, we're going to load in a Octane image texture shader. So this is going to come up an awful lot. Image textures, they let you load files. So click on the image texture under distribution. And if you've ever come across them before, this is where you can load IES data. Now, if you've never come across it before, when a manufacturer makes a light bulb, they scan the light bulb and they work out what shape, what pattern, what brightness, and everything else that the light bulb creates. And they save these as IES files. If you just go on Google and have a search, you will find hundreds of them for free. Please don't pay for them. There's too many free ones. But again, I've included a couple here in the downloaded project folder for you, just so you can grab those. But if I choose a file and I go for this IES file here, it's some ARD 10-meter lamp, something like that. What you'll notice is, okay, the usual thing. Do you want to copy it? Not really, not for the time being. Cinema will now start using this projected shape in your light source. You will notice things go darker. This is because Octane is blocking the light into a certain shape. So a lot of the light has now gone. So do feel free to go back to your power setting, and where it was 7 before, we might need 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000. But as this starts going up, we'll start to hopefully notice, especially if I make this light source smaller, a little dinky light source like this, you're going to start noticing we've actually got shapes and patterns being cast from our light. So that's what the distribution is. It's basically somewhere for you to place IES files. Just keep in mind they must go inside an image texture, otherwise weird wonky things start happening. Okay, what else we got then? So surface brightness. This is a setting you'll find in your lights, and I will also just let you know you will find it in your materials, because materials can emit light as well. Surface brightness tells cinema should the size of the object impact how much light is emitted. So let me just get a nice fresh new area light from Octane. So you will notice this light at the moment is absolutely bleaching out our project. Tons and tons and tons of light in there. So as we change the size of the light, for example, it gets darker and darker and darker and darker. So a small light emits less light than a large one does, which makes sense. But what if you're just trying to get a consistent amount of light, but you don't want it to change just because the size of the actual sort of panel changed? Well, that's what you can do with surface brightness. So it's on by default for this, but if we turn this off, we're getting this amount of light. Now I'm just going to turn the brightness down, just going to lower the power to a more reasonable level. So this is nicely lit, but if I make the light larger, the lighting doesn't change, or rather the brightness doesn't change. The light is now simply more spread out. If I have a teeny tiny light source, it's pretty much the same because it's increasing the brightness of the light to compensate. Again, really that's just kind of a preference, whatever works best for you. I do tend to change the surface brightness because I do actually often change my light size in order to actually quickly change the brightness. Okay, and let's see, anything else down here? We've got double-sided. We mentioned earlier that light doesn't come out the back of a light, only the front, unless you turn on double-sided. And now you have a double-sided light panel. It does always make these sort of weird strips down the middle if it's too close to a surface, which I guess is one of the reasons it's turned off, because this looks fairly natural, whereas this looks a little bit odd. So, again, personal preference. Don't worry too much about normalize. That's a good thing. It keeps the light brightnesses in check so they don't all get out of hand too much. There's not really much reason to turn it off. Sampling rates. This is a way for you to speed up the renders. Frankly, there are far better ways of spending your time trying to speed up renders than faffing around with these sample rates too much. So honestly, just skip over them. They're not really that important. Some fairly familiar settings we'll hopefully know from Cinema's render engines, or others if you've used them. Do you want the light source to show up on soft diffuse surfaces? So basically the absolute basics of light. Do you want things to be illuminated? Do you want them to show up on speculars? In other words, do you want them to sort of reflect in highlights? Probably, but sometimes it can be a nice nifty little trick to tell a light source that it should stop reflecting. So if I have, say, a sphere and it has this dark glossy material we had from earlier, I could tell my lights, hey, don't show up on soft diffuse, but do show up in reflections, i.e. specular. Or vice versa. I can say, do make illumination, but don't show up in reflections. So little artistic cheats which let you get rid of annoying highlights. Again, I don't actually tend to use these too much because there is another way of restricting where lights can go, but we'll save that for one of our more advanced chapters a bit later, I think. I don't want to blow your minds with the boring, mundane stuff too early. And all this stuff down here, ignore it, don't worry about it. Not all that important. Okay, so that is the basics of your lighting for area lights. But we did actually add another main type of light earlier when we were doing our toolbars. So let's lose the Octane light, and let's also lose the HDR sky. And I tell you what, let's also lose the visible sky. So we're back to our big floodlit white scene. The other type of light you've got is the Octane daylight, which is this one we had here. Please, by the way, the icons are very similar. Don't confuse it for the planetary light. That is nowhere near as useful. Octane daylight is very much akin to cinema's physical sky object, in that it will make light and blue sky and sunrise colours and all the rest, except it does it a lot better. So, adding in the daylight, watch out. This daylight will have two tags. The one to the right is actually Cinema 4D's sun expression tag. This tries to use the time and date and position on the planet to accurately position and aim the sun. This is an artistic package. You probably couldn't give a crap about what the technically accurate light direction of the sun would be. You probably just want to point it and make it look nice. At least that's my experience. So feel free to go ahead and delete this tag to the side, because this light fundamentally works by you rotating it. This line you see to the side, this is the direction of the sun, and this tag here keeps overriding it. It keeps changing it for you. So I would honestly advise you to delete that tag. So all you're left with is the orange one here, which is the Octane light tag. What we can now do is aim this thing, point it where we like, and we will have an entire environment. It will give us, if we point it sort of on the horizon, we get a nice warm sunrise or sunset. You can even see it getting reflected in the sphere there. Although I'll tell you what, let's give our sphere a few more polygons, shall we? It's looking a bit worse for wear. There you go. Okay, so when let's just move it over here. So the position of this makes no difference. With the daylight, this thing here is not emitting light. Doesn't do anything. It's only the angle which determines where the sun is travelling to. So our sun is travelling in this direction here, hence you can see the reflection on the sphere over there. So as I point this downwards a bit more, the sun's now coming down, and we've got sort of early morning. Come down from above, we've got a nice sort of midday with some nice harsh, sharp, crisp shadows. And as it comes around to the other side, the shadow swoops over and we go over to a nice evening sunset on the other side. But this does also, if we look up, this does also generate the sky. So there's our sun, and as we move this thing around, you can actually see the sun flying through the sky. So it does make a nicer sky than cinema's physical sky object does. So if you're doing outdoor scenes, absolutely feel free to use this. You could, of course, just use a HDR if you like, but this is quite nice and versatile in that you can actually just really quickly point and aim and choose where the sun goes. Setting wise, there's not much really different I'd tell you to bother with. You've got the power setting again to choose how bright the sun's going to be, but the default is pretty good, pretty natural. You can fake how big the sun is, so you can see a little teeny tiny speck over there in the reflection for the sun. That's about right, that's about natural. That's where it really should be, but you could fake it and say, hey, give me a bigger sun. Again, just for artistic reasons. This isn't realistic. The setting of 1 is the actual sort of real world size that you should see. You can change the sky color, but it is controlled through the daylight model. You can change the sun color, but again, it is controlled through the daylight model. As you're working, you can just choose a few different options here, but it is all controlled for you, and you probably don't really want to change it unless you're trying to do, say, some sort of alien planet with some weird colors. And again, that's about it. I don't want to waste your time with settings you don't really need. This isn't a complete reference manual. They're boring. So we're just doing the settings which actually make a difference to your real life. I will just mention one other little tiny bit over here, though. Not really related to lighting as such, but if you're after a way of adding fog and mist to your scene, the best way is actually to do it through the Octane Daylight object, because under Medium, and by medium it means sort of what something's made of, the substance. In this case, it's talking about the substance of the atmosphere. What medium is it? There is just a really nice, quick, easy add fog button. Click it, it throws stuff in. I should warn you, fog and atmospherics and volumetrics in Octane are not particularly fast to render. In fact, you could probably describe them as being downright slow for all this grain here to sort of eventually resolve. This is a very basic scene. If you actually have like harsh car headlights trying to shoot through the fog, it gets quite slow. So just a warning, it's not going to be a particularly quick thing to work with. But if you do want to change the settings, leave this alone. That's pretty good. If you want to change the color and the thickness of the fog, click on this scattering medium button you will see here. You will only see this after you've added fog. But in here, you will have density. How thick is the fog? If you turn up the density, it gets thicker and thicker and more foggy. So the default is just sort of a light bit of fog. If you're wondering, well, okay, that's cool and I like the fog, but I want to get my sky back and my sun. You can kind of limit how far the fog goes. It's not, I guess, really that realistic, but you can do it. If you go back to your daylight tag, you've got medium radius. This is essentially how far does this all extend. And the default, let's count a few zeros here, is, hang on, let's see, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million? 10 million? Oh, I can't count the zeros, there's too many for the interface. But basically, if you knock a zero off, you're going to start seeing more of the sky coming through. If I knock another zero off, you're going to get a bit more still. So if you limit how far the fog can go, there we go. There will now be a point where you can actually start to see your environment again. So that, I guess, can be quite a useful thing, because otherwise you're just completely immersed in this creepy Stephen King mist where you can never really escape. So I don't know, let's maybe sort of split the difference. Let's go maybe 2,000, 3,000. Again, this will also depend on what scene scale you're using. So in your project settings, keep in mind you've got a scene project scale. It will vary based on what you've got set in here. So you might need more zeros or less. Okay, so there you go. That's not a bad in between.